Okay, do that. And good. Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, thanks, Adam and Fernandez, for inviting me. And I think I'll just get right to it. Um, I'll talk about the past and the future of present time consciousness. Early on, Varela was influenced by Dreyfus's negative view of Husserl. So in the embodied mind, for example, we find critical comments concerning Husserl. But by the late 1990s, Varela had changed his mind. I think he was influenced by, for example, Jean Petitot in Paris on this. And specifically, he appealed to Husserl's analysis of intrinsic temporality in his essay, Present Time Consciousness, which is a version of another essay called The Species Present, the Neurophenomenology of Inner Time Consciousness. Varela's account attempts to work out the details of a dynamical integration of objectively measurable timescales with Husserl's intrinsic temporality, which is Husserl's account of time consciousness in terms of retention, impression, protension, which Adam just mentioned. Specifically, Varela offers three different timescales in terms of trying to characterize from a more objective perspective. One is the elementary timescale measured in milliseconds, and so that would be timescale where one registers brain processes. The second is the integration timescale measured in seconds, and this is what he equated with the species present, or in Husserl's analysis, the retentional, protensional type of interaction that happens. And then the narrative timescale, which would involve memory and which would be something of a different issue. He references several of Husserl's diagrams that indicate a source point, which is the primal impression. But he also notes a kind of dissatisfaction with the diagrams because they are too static. And he suggests that we take a more dynamical view on the structures of time consciousness. Here he favorably quotes Merleau-Ponty, who says time is not a line, but a network of intentionalities. So if we go back to Husserl, just very briefly, time looks more like a line, or at least what we are, in fact, experiencing can be diagrammed on the line. So his favorite example is a melody. So we're listening to a melody, and in terms of the present note that's being sounded, there is a primal impression of that note that we have in what he refers to as a phase of consciousness. But there are also past phases of consciousness that don't simply disappear. In fact, we have a retention of the just past phase, which itself has a retention of the phase before that. So there is what he says builds up as a kind of retentional train of the past moments, which allows us to actually hear the melody. We don't hear just one note, we hear one note that has been that follows notes that we've already heard, and we hear it in that way. In addition, we have a protensional aspect that that is directed towards the future, which is not yet there, but one can expect that there is going to be another note in the melody. And each of those phases of consciousness have this threefold structure of primal impression, retention, and protension. One extra thing to mention here is that, for example, retention has a longitudinal style of intentionality, which simply means that the retention is a retention of the immediate retention of the past phase of consciousness. And it also has a what he calls a transverse, Husserl calls a transverse aspect of intentionality, which simply means that we are aware of the previous note because we are aware of the past experience that we've had of it. So the longitudinal aspect actually is an explanation of how it is that we are able to have a pre-reflective self-awareness, an awareness of our own experience, as we are having an awareness of the temporal object, which is the melody. Okay, using Husserl's distinction between the longitudinal and transverse intentionality of retention, which are grounding self-awareness and object awareness, respectively, Varela argues that the inseparability of these two intentionalities here is not only descriptively accurate, but part of the intrinsic logic of complex nonlinear dynamics. Here again, he brings in the notion of the elementary and the integration timescales. And he shows, in effect, that there is something like a nonlinear dynamics at work here. Dennett and Kinsborn, a little bit earlier, had already argued that the temporal sequence of brain events is not necessarily the same as the experienced sequence. So elementary and integration timescales may be in nonlinear relation in this respect. And you can see this if you start to look at, for example, the timing involved in the timing of processing involved in different sense modalities. So in his 1999 paper, Varela recognizes that, in fact, this is just a start. And he asks his readers to consider, he says, to consider what I propose in the remainder of this text as a sketch of future work more than anything else. Varela's Husserlian analysis continues to be influential. So recent attempts to work out a predictive processing account, for example, take Varela and Husserl and Varela as a starting point. So you can see this early on in Rick Rush's 2006 paper, where he introduces the notion of a trajectory. Jakob Hoey also, in his paper with colleagues, talk about distrusting the present and starts with Husserl and builds on Varela's analysis. Wanja Weiss, Kristen, and Juan here, Bogota, have papers as well as McKenna. Like Varela, these accounts attempt to understand how the temporality of subpersonal processes relate to the personal experience of temporal objects. And they all support a naturalized dynamical view where the present impression as the origin is being continually displaced by protensional, future-oriented processes. So these accounts, as well as Varela's account, as well, in fact, as almost all accounts that start with Husserl, except perhaps for some more recent discussions of a handful of Husserl scholars, all of them take their point of departure from Husserl's early phenomenology of time consciousness, the time consciousness lectures that he started to give in 1904, continued over a number of years. And that's where you find the familiar retention, primal impression, protension structure, where the primal impression is the experiential point of origin. I'm going to argue, however, that a little bit later in Husserl's development, in 1917, he had already provided a better and more dynamical account that sees protension as the driving element. His later writings are contained in what are called the Bernau manuscripts, 1917-18. These were only published in 2001, so this was after Varela wrote his work. So Varela was not familiar with these manuscripts. And they already are anticipating the future emphasis on dynamical processes by endorsing a view that clearly discounts the present understood in terms of primal impression. To be sure, Husserl is not offering a naturalized version or an account of embodied brain processes. But his analysis could certainly inform something like that and make for a better starting point. So in the summer of 1917 and spring of 1918, Husserl goes to Bernau in the Black Forest for several months, and he begins to rework his thinking about time consciousness. Protension takes on a more important role. In his early analysis, protension is something like the reverse of retention. It's an intentional projection towards the future, a kind of turned around, forward directed retentioning, oriented towards the phase of consciousness that is not yet there. But there are some asymmetries that he starts to puzzle about. So first, in the present, retention is always fulfilled. Protension is not yet fulfilled. It's unfulfilled. Second, he can describe retention as a kind of continuum. But with respect to protension, it looks more like a horizon. And third, he had not really applied the longitudinal transverse intentionality trajectory to protension. He had only analyzed that in terms of retention. So there are these kind of asymmetries that he's puzzling about in the Bernau manuscripts. The core difference or asymmetry between protension and retention is apparent when one thinks of how they must be related. Retention always constrains protension. What we have experienced constrains what we expect to experience. But in a different way, previous protension affects the new retention, since a new retention will always be a retention of a just having been protension, but not vice versa. So the starting point for the earlier Husserl was the primal impression in the now phase. Protension seems to simply accompany that. But when he gets to Bernau, he starts to emphasize that the primal impression will be either a fulfillment or a non-fulfillment of the previous protension. So in Bernau, Husserl considers that protension is already working prior to the primary impression, or what he there calls the impression, in a way that has an effect on the primal impression. Protension in the immediate past phase of consciousness has already set the stage for the present primal impression. So, for example, before we begin to hear the first note or any subsequent note, there's already a kind of expectation on our part. Primal impression exists as constantly in the mode of a fulfillment of protension, and of course, is constantly being modified in a retention of the past. As a result, the primal impression emerges or is enacted only in the dynamical relation of retention and protension. It's no longer the origin or the starting point, something already existing, but rather it's the result or the product of a dynamical retentional-protensional process. Also, retention and protension are mutually shaping each other. Protension, remaining more or less indeterminate, is to some extent constrained by prior retentions, and the present retention is a carrying forward of the sense of the prior protensions. Thus, Husserl talks of protension in retention and retention in protension. The current phase of consciousness registers the previous protension as fulfilled or not fulfilled, and in this sense of fulfillment, it's is itself retained in the next phase. So Husserl's idea in Bernau is that the point of departure, rather than being primal impression, is the empty, that is, the yet unfulfilled protensional anticipation. The primal impression is not the origin or point of departure. as he had been saying, as something absolutely unmodified, the primal source of all further consciousness and being. It's rather the boundary between retention and protension, the result of a dynamical interplay between retention and protension, a kind of line of intersection between retentional and protensional tendencies. So you can see this in a contrast between his early description from a lecture in 1905. He says the primal impression is something absolutely unmodified, the primal source of all further consciousness and being. Primal impression has as its content that which the word now signifies, insofar as it is taken in the strictest sense. In the Bernauer description, he says, the now, that is, the primal presentation, is the boundary between retentions and protensions. This slide just simply suggests that he maybe gets some of his wording, specifically about boundary, from a late text by Brentano. And in any case, Husserl suggests that the complicated interlacing of retention and protension is constitutive of the present. Primal impression is not only non-self-sufficient, it is the constituted product by way of a protensional fulfillment, rather than something that makes a constitutive contribution on its own. So like a gesture that prefigures a solution that is not yet enunciated, Husserl really continues to struggle with this. His diagrams, or what he calls the protensional diagrams, start to change. And he says, first, there is an empty, unfulfilled expectation. The primary presentation comes to be in the flow only by occurring as the fulfillment of contents relative to the preceding empty intentions, thereby changing itself into primal presenting perception. So the notion of an isolated primal impression is really an abstraction and not something that exists in itself. We should abandon the idea that the primal impression is the originary, direct, straight, and simple apprehension of some now point that is unaffected by retention and protension. I'm going to skip these slides. They just go into more detail about how retention and protension relate to each other. And I'll end here. The intrinsic temporal retention, impression, protension structure is a dynamical process in the sense that a certain anticipatory aspect already shaped by what has just gone before is already complicating the immediacy of the present. Consciousness is not a passive reception of the present. It actively constitutes the meaning of the present in the shadow of what has just been experienced and in the light of what it anticipates. As Husserl put it, every living is living towards. And Rudolf Bernet summarizes this very nicely. He's perhaps one of the leading scholars on time consciousness in Husserl. Rudolf says, this originary process as a life process is not simply an automatic process. It has a goal and the tendency to draw near to this goal. This determination of the originary process of life as striving towards intuitive givenness forces Husserl, as already mentioned, to a new dynamic reformulation of the process of temporal fulfillment. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.